So we're talking about Apollo Elements, which is a JavaScript library for the front end that implements web components that use GraphQL. So basically, we have base classes, class mixins, and other kinds of helpers that support using different web components libraries. What that means is that you can write a GraphQL component once and then use it anywhere in any different framework across multiple teams. Great, I'm really glad this is coming through, and please just let me know if you miss out on something. Feel free to jump in, I can go back. So yeah, it's Apollo client, but it's web components. So if you're not familiar with what a web component is or how it works, a web component, also known as a custom element, is a JavaScript class that extends from HTML element. And inside of that class, you have these built-in lifecycle callbacks that you can use to attach behaviors to your element, give it its own inner private DOM and styles, and other things like that. So a typical web component usage might be to instantiate it here in the constructor, then attach a shadow root with the attach shadow method on HTML element. And then we're going to give that shadow root some DOM, like this span that just gets the emoji attribute from the element and puts it here in the private DOM, or this empty paragraph with an ID. Now, ordinarily, what we would want to do is use a template element for that, for performance, instead of just inner HTMLing all the things. But in this case, for the sake of brevity, we'll just do that. And then once you pass this class to the custom elements.define method, which is available on the window, and give it a tag name, so that element becomes available for use in your document. So web components, they're just HTML elements. You can put them anywhere. They can interact with the page just like a div or a video element or a list or a details widget, except you are the one that gets to write the behavior of that element. So what would it look like if we wrote custom elements that used GraphQL? Well, a lot of the time we think about GraphQL in terms of queries representing a certain slice of data. So we would want our element to basically provide some UI that is a function of our GraphQL query. The way that we're going to do that with Apollo Elements, a simpler example using just the basic HTML element is with this Apollo query mixin. And by extending from this Apollo query mixin applied to HTML elements, what we'll get is all these extra GraphQL related behaviors on our elements prototype. So we can assign a GraphQL query to that element. In this case, see, now that I saw the last talk, I feel bad that I chose person for my example, right? Because you've had cats and like, you can't compete with cats, right? But okay, we're gonna go with person. We'll imagine it's a person dressed up as a cat. That'll make us feel better. So we have this person query where we're gonna fetch a person by ID, get their name and picture and a list of friends with each friend's name. And then in this attribute changed callback, which is a built-in lifecycle callback on every custom element, we can check for changes to specific attributes. So we can say if the attribute that changed was person ID, then let's set the variables property. Variables is a property on every Apollo query element. That's something that we get from Apollo query mixin. So every time the person ID changes, we're going to set the variable properties to be the ID of this new person. And that will actually initialize our query, so it'll start going out and fetching our data. Now, what do we do when we get our data back? Well, in order to be able to render out our DOM, we can just set up a getter-setter pair for data. And every time it changes in the setter, we'll call some render function, which we get to define ourselves. In this case, we'll just fill the friends paragraph from before with some text based on the list of friends that we have there. Once we've written this element, we can use it in any web page. All you have to do is bring in the script that defines it and pop it into your page. Give it a person ID, and away you go. You're going to get that DOM on your page. You could use the DOM APIs as well to just insert it. But we're not limited to just using the bare bones custom elements HTML and DOM APIs, right? Those are very low level, and their custom element APIs are actually intended to be used primarily by libraries. Well, luckily for us, there's a whole ecosystem of web components libraries out there that help us to write our components, and we can use them to write sort of these declarative templates, which match up really nicely with our declarative data that we get from GraphQL. So let's take a look at an example of the same kind of person element that's written using lit element, which is one of the more popular web components libraries. So we're going to grab the base class from lit Apollo, and we're also going to bring in HTML, which is the template tag literal, which lets us do our templating. Also want to bring in a couple extra helpers, custom element to define our element, property to do the data reactivity. Let's import our query, this time using a build step. So we can use rollup or web dev server to let us import GraphQL as JavaScript objects. Same thing for the CSS. And we can bring in these types that we use GraphQL code gen to generate based on our query documents. I really like this style of development because then in your source folder, you get like each component has its own styles, its own template, and its own query. So if you just want to know what the data is for the component, you can open up the query file and see it right there. I think that's a nice experience. So this is what our element might look like if we were defining it with lit element. We can use this custom element Typescript decorator, which basically does the same thing as the global custom elements define. And instead of extending from HTML element, we'll extend from Apollo query, which in turn inherits from lit element. And we can pass in these TypeScript type arguments, data and variables, which we got from CodeGen. What that'll do is give us like this.data, so we can validate the properties on this.data. And it'll also give us this.variables, which will validate those properties. Inside the class body, by the way, this refers to the element, the actual person element DOM object, the component itself. So this first line of the class body is setting up a reactive property. So we'll call that property person ID. That'll be the name of the property on the element. And we can associate it explicitly with a person-ID attribute. So users of our element could then either set the attribute using HTML, or they could set the property using JavaScript, and both would be fine. We can apply our styles to the element, and then we'll set up this updated callback, which comes from lit element. And every time the person ID changes, just like we did before, we'll set the variables property and start to query our data. All we have left to do is render our template, and that'll look like this. We can grab our name and our friends off of data.person, right? And we'll have that nice type checking from the TypeScript types. And we can render out our template, a paragraph with ID of friends, and we'll map out our list of friends. Now, you might be kind of getting spidey sense watching me use IDs freely in reusable components. Say, hey, well, what if there's another element on the page with ID of friends? Well, thanks to the shadow DOM that we talked about earlier, this ID is local to our component, so it's isolated. If you would call document.getElement by ID friends, you wouldn't get it. So we can do whatever we want here in our shadow DOM. That's one of the benefits of web components. I wanted to show you an example of how to do this same component, but instead of using lit element, using haunted, which is kind of an implementation of a React hooks API, but for web components. And we support that in Apollo elements as well. So if you're used to, or you prefer to use a hooks-like syntax and you want to, call a use query and get your data that way, you can do that as well. And you get that same sort of declarative templating that you would expect to get from, like, say, JSX or another templating language, here just using vanilla JavaScript. And that brings us to mutations, right? Because we don't want to just read data with our components. We also sometimes want to affect the graph as well. So in Apollo elements, we have three options for making mutations. There's an Apollo mutation component, which comes ready-made with a bunch of features that give you the ability to issue mutations. We have, for the different web components libraries, an Apollo mutation base class or the mutation mixin, or in the case of haunted, the use mutation hook. Or you can always just get a handle on your Apollo client instance and call and mutate imperatively. Actually, at work, I'm using all three of these methods depending on the situation. But right now, I just want to go right now into the Apollo mutation component to see how that works and how we can do declarative GraphQL mutations using nothing but HTML. So if we import our component and we set it here on the page, we can actually just pass in a GraphQL script element as a child and set the mutation property on the component that way. If we do that, the component will get its mutation property just from this child element. You don't have to use HTML for this. You can also set the mutation property using the DOM, like through a framework or something like that. But this is a really nice way if you just want to sort of declaratively put a mutation in your document. You can just plop the script tag in there and away you go. But what about the variables, right? So we have an input object here, which is a quote input. How are we going to set those variables? Well, we can bring in an input web component, let's say. And if we put it in the variable slot, which you can see here on the second line, slot equals variable. Slot is a web component's feature. So that says that this element here slots into a specific name slot on the parent, on the Apollo mutation component. So if we put this in the variable slot and give it a data variable attribute, then our component, when it issues the mutation, it'll say, oh, I have a variable called name. And the value for that variable should be the value of this text field. So whatever the user types into that text field will be the value for that variable. We can do the same thing for comment. And now, how are we going to trigger our mutation and actually send off our variables to the endpoint? Well, we can just slot in a trigger button component, and we'll be good to go. You might have noticed, though, that the mutation that we have has one variable called input. It doesn't have two, one called name and one called comment. So what we can do is add an input key attribute to the mutation element, and that will tell it that all of the variables that you see on the text fields, you should wrap them up into an object called input. That'll give us this as our final variables. So here we have a GraphQL mutation, and we haven't written a single line of JavaScript. So one of the main benefits to web components is that you can use them anywhere, right? Like you can write them using lit elements and use them in a haunted application, or you can write them using hybrids and use them in a Microsoft Fast application. And you can also use them in sort of traditional DOM frameworks. So here's an example of a couple web components I wrote before, SpaceX launches. This queries the SpaceX GraphQL API and gets a list of launches. And this other one here, SpaceX launch, displays a specific launch by ID, right? And what we're going to do is have Angular communicate with both of these elements via events and DOM properties. So if I select a launch from the dropdown, looks like that's a big if today. Okay, so our component is querying the SpaceX API. So we have 0 launches, everything's loading, great. Yeah, so if we select, let's say, demo set, then this paragraph right here, which is rendered by Angular, it's not rendered by my web component, it's rendered by Angular. That'll be there. And then down here, this other GraphQL component written using Apollo elements is getting its launch ID from that list up here via Angular. And it can then query for the details on that element. And this same exact web component, which is published to NPM, we can use it in a Preact app as well, or in a Svelte app. And it'll work the same way. So if your company has maybe a GraphQL team, or maybe a UI team, UI components team, You could publish privately or even publicly a collection of GraphQL web components that could be used across multiple different teams, across multiple different frameworks, in different micro front ends. Sky's the limit. There's a lot more going on in Apollo Elements. Like we have a generator, kind of like create React app, that you can use to initialize an entire application or to add a component to an already initialized application. We have got an Apollo client component, which lets you easily assign a specific Apollo client to a specific instance of a web component. So like in this demo, we have two different clients, one that's going to the SpaceX API and one that's going to the Rick and Morty API. And they both have the same introspection query component underneath, which just renders an introspection query. So if we run this demo, we'll see that they should go and get different data from the respective clients. Makes me think of like loading up old video games. Remember? Reticulating splines. What was that? Was that StarCraft? Gosh, can't remember. Okay, I think maybe our demo server's not loading the fastest today, but you get the idea. What you should expect to see here is the different introspection queries for each different API. Yeah, so we have an extensive documentation site for Apollo Elements. If you want to learn more, check it out at apolloelements.dev. We've got guides, we've got extensive API docs. And I'd love to hear from you. You can join me on the Polymer Slack, on Discord, file issues, join the discussion. I'd be happy to hear from you.
Thank you, Benny.
You're welcome.
Benny, can you hear me? Yeah, okay, I got it.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for the talk. I think there's a bunch of questions that already come up, and we had Sonia already asked in the chat one of the questions. So what are the benefits of using such a GraphQL custom web component over a React component? Okay,
that's a great question, Sonia. So like most things, it depends on what your specific needs are, right? So like if you have a huge React app and all of your developers are React developers, so maybe you should just keep writing React, right? But on the other hand, so a lot of the benefits of web components and custom elements are some of the things that I mentioned before. So we have framework interoperability, we have DOM encapsulation via the shadow DOM, we have things like future-proofing. So I'm still using web components from like 4 years ago in my apps, and maybe they could be improved, or the performance could be improved or something like that. But however they're implemented internally doesn't really bother me, because they can have their own internal mechanisms and update at their own slow pace. As long as the external HTML and DOM APIs stay the same, I'm golden, and I can use it in my super modern, Typescript everything apps today. So those are some of the big benefits of web components. And like we've seen, you can write your GraphQL web components using Apollo Elements, and then you can use them in React, right? So you could do that also with React in just sort of like vanilla JavaScript or web components-based apps, but it'd be a little harder to do. You'd have to do a little bit more fancy footwork in order to hook things up together.
And what would you recommend? Because it seems like web components has not quite caught up in terms of popularity and adoption compared to a lot of the framework approach. So what would be your recommendation for someone sort of new to web components, especially coming from frameworks like Vue and React?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so like I'm not really sure where this perception of like nobody uses web components comes from, because like really a lot of people use web components. Google obviously. Google kind of invented web components. It was a Google project, but now it's an open standard. Adobe ships web components. Microsoft has their own web components library. Apple ships web components. They're all over the place. And in terms of what I'd recommend to developers who are starting out, who maybe have a background in frameworks, is I'd say if you have the time to learn and you're curious and you want to try something new, give it a shot. I can tell you that I learned a lot about React and frameworks from building web components. Right? So seeing how it's done using the built-in browser APIs and platform gave me a lot of insights into how it could be done in frameworks. And once I got kind of up to speed in that component-based mentality, I wrote those 5 demos with Angular, React, Preact. It's all kind of the same thing. It's just kind of juggling syntax. So I would recommend, and I wholeheartedly suggest that everyone try it out. Maybe do a side project in Lit Element or something like that. Maybe you'll like it.
Great. I don't see any. We have a question. I'm not sure if you want to tackle this, but perhaps you want to give this a go. What are the best practices using GraphQL in Vue.js? Is that something that you have an opinion on?
Sure. Well, I think you should write your GraphQL components in Apollo Elements and then use those in Vue.js, right? I mean, I'm biased, right? But there really isn't anything stopping you from doing that. So you could do that. I know there are GraphQL libraries for Vue, and that's good too. If that works for you and your team, go for it. And you know what? You can also use Apollo. There's like a third-party Apollo Vue library. Apollo Elements is third-party also, by the way. It's not an Apollo thing. So you could use the Apollo Vue library, and you could also use Apollo Elements for a specific component or something like that. There's really nothing stopping you. It's all about that mix and match kind of Lego experience of putting things together.
Gotcha. Great. Well, thank you so much for joining. Thank you for everyone who participated in the questions. And Benny, I hope to see you soon at one of our future meetups, maybe.
Thank you.